So as far as the schedule is concerned, we are going to stay at the same pace. We're just not going to spend 3 days on these two sections. We're going to spend 2 days on these sections, which is a little annoying because I was kind of going to use Wednesday as like a review day. However, as always, I'll always be around on an exam day during class time, and pretty much zero people show up then, which is fine. But we can use that time for the review time uh, to make up for the lost, essentially, hour if you need it. So that part's going to stay the same. We're still trying to finish up and having our exam on Friday, but these guys over here are going to be different. They're all going to be pushed back a little bit, but they haven't updated the schedule. So if you go to like any other page and look at the dates, they will be up to date. So tonight we have the part two homework due, and then part three will be due tomorrow, and then our last one will be due Thursday, which is a little weird, but it's better than having it due after the exam, so you can actually try it. And then, like I said, exam on Friday. So, where we left off was in part one and somewhat part two. We created this singular table for these 7 intent questions in our survey. And we were doing things like what's the average, how many people responded, how many were 1 through 5, and then like last of all, we had this weighted average. When we started part two, it was essentially more of the same, except instead of these blue guys, the questions were about these green guys. And if you've looked at the homework, there's actually the exact same questions about these yellow guys in the middle. Now, as I've mentioned before, there's a lot of repetition in this, and you want to take advantage of that. Like there's a bunch of averages here and counting and so forth. You don't want to have to start from scratch every time. So we are going to use the fact that these guys are all right next to each other to essentially take our calculator and drag, because they are in fact right underneath the ones we want. Right underneath intent is uniqueness, which shows up in the homework. Right underneath that is frequency, which shows up in the workbook, which means I can drag this down and I'm essentially done with part two. That's all there is to that. So use that to your advantage, use dragging, and put all 21 of these in your table because there will be questions about them. You'll notice I didn't drag down this last column, and that's because average purchase probability is specific to intent. We are going to add something to frequency called estimated annual usage. Now I'm just going to build that one from scratch, but it is just another weighted average. Now, there was a second half of part two where we also wanted to look at frequency and ignore the fives. I'm going to come back to that after I introduce part three, but because it's very similar. But essentially, it's not too bad if you approach it the way I'm going to show you how to approach part three. But real quick before I do that, if you have not made this table, I would strongly recommend building this, even if you have to start over, because really it's only 3 formulas that build this entire section: arithmetic and 1 weighted average. So honestly, it's not that much work if you look at it by what creates it. The rest is just dragging. So, okay, build that if you haven't. Now, what are we doing today? Today, we are furthering our criteria of what we're going to be looking at, like this ignore 5 stuff. And instead, we're going to be looking at gender and age. So instead of throwing out responses if they put a 5, we're going to be like looking at, well, only if they wrote down they were male, only if they wrote down they're female, only if they wrote down they were in a specific age group. So how do we do that? Well, if we look at our transposed data, there's these 2 rows up here that tell us their response to these 2 questions for gender and age. And then on the response codes tabs, just a quick reminder of what those things mean. And so For instance, I'm only going to average these blue numbers if there's a 1 up here, because that would imply male, right? So, how do we do this? Well, we have a pretty good idea. It's just another criteria, just like we saw on the first day when I reminded you of how count ifs and average ifs work. If you need another criteria, you just add a comma, add another range, comma, add another criteria. That's the basic idea. So how can we do this? Well, here's one way which I would recommend not doing. Try not to have like a table for every part of the book. So like here's my part 1 table, here's my part 2 table, and then I'm going to make a table for males and then a table for females, and then as we get further, a table for males 45 and under. This is horrible. You have to start over every single time. It's not super efficient. So what I would recommend doing is essentially we're going to take this original table and add some switches to it so that we can quickly change it back and forth between one age group versus another. So how do we do that? How do we change a calculator without having to dive into the code every time? Well, what we've been doing all semester is essentially adding some input cells to our calculator. So, like I said a second ago, you are going to be adding criteria, and it's not that bad. It's just these 3 cells right here. You're going to go in there and say, hey, make sure there's a 1 in the gender row, something like that. But instead of typing the 1 inside your formula, have it reference a cell above the calculator. And then all I have to do is say, hey, let's make this a 1. Bam, there's my male numbers. Let's make this a 2. There's my female numbers. And I can do the same thing with age and the same thing with ignoring 5s. If I want to ignore 5s, I have a criteria here where I say, okay, make sure that particular row is less than 5s. And check it out. I'm not counting any of my 5s anymore. So it's a nice little switch, so I don't have to start over and build tables from scratch every single time. Now, you might have also noticed I wrote a little note to myself. If you want to turn off these little switches, we use greater than equal to 0. Why? Well, I did say we're ignoring zeros, so why am I including the zeros here? Well, let's say we're on the first question of part 3, and I change my gender to 1 for males. Why am I allowing for zeros in age? Well, if the question only cares about did they put a 1 for the gender question on the survey, I do not care if they skipped the age question. Does that make sense? So if the question doesn't relate to, one of these things, one of these 3 questions, I don't care if they answered it. Another thing you might have noticed is I have 2 switches for age. And the reason why is you're going to have questions that are like, what if they're between 26 and 55? And so I need an upper bound and lower bound to say, like greater than equal to 3 and less than or equal to 5. And now I'm looking just between those 2 age brackets. And so you're going to be adding criteria that points up here to these 3 cells, just 3, and then you drag. Not too bad. Also, if you just add it to this first one, the code is so identical that you can just copy and paste it into these other 2, which is really nice.